Courthouse records in Charleston still carry a shadow that locals whisper about a scandal they call the Beaufort Deception. On March 15, 1855, a marriage certificate was signed twice by the same woman, once as Elelena Ravenel, the adopted daughter, and again as Elelena Beaufort, the lawful wife of the very man who had raised her for 8 years. What lies in those faded signatures is only the surface of a story that spiraled into murder, fraud, and ruthless ambition. For decades, the Beaufort family swept aside anyone who stood between them and the rice plantations that made them one of the most powerful dynasties of the antebellum South. What happened inside that Charleston mansion between 1847 and 1855 would test the meaning of family loyalty and the extremes people will reach to hold on to wealth and power. In 1847, Charleston glittered as the crown jewel of Southern society, where cobblestone streets wound beneath oak trees, heavy with Spanish moss, and the air mixed the sweetness of jasmine with the brutal reality of slavery. Behind the elegance of Broad Street's grand houses lived the Beauforts, whose name was etched in marble on banks and whispered in the back rooms of politics. At the head of the dynasty stood Silas Beaufort, a man of silver hair and piercing eyes, who wore the charm of old money, but plotted his fortunes with the cold calculation of a general. From Magnolia Grove, a vast plantation worked by hundreds of enslaved people, he spread his influence across the Low Country through land deals and marriages that tightened the family's grip on power. The Beaufort mansion itself was a towering symbol of their reach, its balconies facing the harbor where ships carried their riches north. Inside, chandeliers shimmered over polished floors, while ancestral portraits gazed down, their painted eyes holding secrets no one dared speak aloud. Outwardly, Silas, his sickly wife Margaret, and their 3 children projected refinement, hosting lavish dinners that bound Charleston's elite closer together. But behind closed doors, their conversations sounded less like a family's and more like a war council plotting which estates to acquire next. That careful facade began to crack in the fall of 1847, when a string of sudden deaths among neighboring families stirred whispers in Charleston's gossip circles. The tragedy of the Ravenels soon followed, setting in motion a chain of events that exposed the Beaufort dynasty's hunger for land and influence, a hunger that would be fed by deception, violence, and betrayal. The fire that destroyed the Ravenel plantation erupted just past midnight on November 3, 1847, in the middle of one of the driest autumns the Carolina Low Country had ever seen. Witnesses later recalled flames clawing at the sky like living creatures, their glow visible for miles, while the stench of burning timber carried a strange chemical tang, as if something more than dry wood and cotton had fueled the inferno. By sunrise, the great house was nothing but smoldering chimney stones and warped fragments of iron, the last remnants of a home and its history. James Ravenel, his wife Sarah, and their infant son perished in the blaze. Only 10-year-old Elelena survived. Searchers found her 3 days later, wandering through the charred gardens, her dress singed, her eyes distant and hollow, as though she had stared straight into hell itself. In her hands she gripped a half-melted wooden doll, the paint blistered by heat. In a whisper, she spoke of masked men who had come in the night. Dr. Hamilton Prescott, who examined her afterward, noted in his private journals that she bore no burns or smoke damage, yet she knew intimate details of what had happened in rooms far from where she claimed to have been. When asked, she repeated the same phrase Papa told me to hide when the bad men came. No such hiding place was ever found. The official report signed by Sheriff Thomas Rutledge pinned the tragedy on an overturned oil lamp in James Ravenel's study. The conclusion suited those eager for a simple explanation, especially since the family had been struggling financially after poor rice harvests. But the fire's behavior raised questions. The main house was reduced to ash, yet the slave quarters and outbuildings remained mostly untouched. Even more suspicious, valuable livestock had been relocated to distant fields days before the blaze. And the documents James Ravenel kept locked in his study, a cache of deeds, inheritance papers, and land surveys, proving claims to territories far larger than his immediate estate, vanished without a trace. Those papers, had they survived, would have made young Elela Nana one of the richest heirs in South Carolina. Almost too quickly, Silas Beaufort appeared at the scene. He claimed to have heard of the fire from a field hand at Magnolia Grove, though later accounts contradicted the timeline. He took control at once, arranging burial shelter for Elela Nina and medical care, with the polished air of Christian charity. Charleston society praised him for his swift compassion. Yet behind the applause lurked a darker truth. Only 2 days before the fire, Silas had been the last visitor to James Ravenel, meeting him privately about what James had told his wife were urgent business matters that could change everything for our family. Within hours of the ashes cooling, the Ravenel fortune was gone, and Elela Nana's future was placed firmly under the watchful eye of the Beaufort dynasty. The years after Elela Nana was brought into the Beaufort home unfolded like a story written for public approval, each chapter designed to display the family's generosity and grace. To Charleston society, she was the orphan saved by Christian charity, raised with wealth and refinement by a family admired across the Low Country. She blossomed into a striking young woman, her golden hair and green eyes drawing compliments at every church service and gathering, while her poise and sharp mind made her the envy of her peers. But behind the polished doors of the East Bay Street mansion, life was anything but idyllic. Elela Nana's education was exceptional music literature and languages taught by tutors chosen from Charleston's most respected families. But her freedom was an illusion. Every lesson was supervised, every letter read before it left the house, and every visit carefully chaperoned. She was forbidden to return to her family's plantation ruins, told such memories would only weaken her fragile health. To outsiders, it looked like protection. To her, it felt like captivity, dressed in fine clothes. As the seasons passed, Margaret Beaufort's health declined in unsettling ways. Dr. Prescott became a regular presence, yet his visits offered no cure. Servants whispered of sudden fits of confusion, stabbing stomach pains, and moments when Margaret failed to recognize her own children. The whispers grew darker, hinting at poison, though none dared speak too loudly. By the spring of 1855, as Elela Nana neared her 18th birthday, the mansion's atmosphere shifted. Charles, once affectionate and protective, now recoiled from her presence, his expression clouded with unease. Victoria, once her closest companion, made cryptic remarks about duty sacrifice and the price of maintaining the Beaufort name. Even the servants looked at Elela Nana with wary eyes, as if pity and fear had taken root in equal measure. Most unsettling of all was Silas Beaufort. The man who had once soothed her childhood nightmares now studied her with the gaze of a strategist. His words lost their warmth, replaced by the cadence of business dealings. He spoke often of consolidation, of protecting family assets, of matters too complex for her to yet understand. And whenever she asked about the possibility of marriage beyond the family circle, he brushed the question aside with a finality that left her heart sinking. The truth began to bleed through one night, when she paused outside the plantation office door left slightly ajar. Inside, she heard Charles protest about legal complications, his voice edged with unease. Silas answered with cold resolve, speaking of arrangements that must be made and obstacles that would need to be removed. They spoke of her not as a daughter, but as a resource, a piece of property to be managed. From that night on, Elela Nana lay awake in her canopy bed, listening to the muffled hum of late-night conversations, echoing through the mansion's halls, each whisper confirming her growing fear that her fate was being sealed without her consent. Elela Nana began to notice details that once slipped past her. Certain rooms were always locked, no matter the hour. Letters arrived only to vanish into drawers before she could glimpse their contents. Conversations halted in mid-sentence when she entered the parlor, eyes flicking toward her with guarded silence. But what unsettled her most was the change in Margaret Beaufort. In rare moments of clarity, Margaret would clutch her hand with startling strength and whisper warnings about trusting no one, about secrets buried deeper than Charleston's oldest graveyards, and about debts that must someday be paid for years of lies wrapped in luxury. These flashes of lucidity were brief, always collapsing into confusion that left her staring at Alela Nena like a stranger trespassing in her chamber. The truth of the family's situation struck without warning on a stifling August afternoon in 1855, when Alela Nena was summoned to Silas Beaufort's study. The meeting was conducted with an unusual air of ceremony. Silas sat behind his polished desk, his silver hair damp with sweat, and beside him stood Josiah Piton, the family's longtime attorney. The thick curtains shut out the harbor breeze, and the air felt heavy with expectation as dust swirled in the sunlight cutting through the gaps. Silas spoke slowly, as though every word had been rehearsed. He admitted that the family's once stable fortune was crumbling. Railroad ventures had failed, business partners had abandoned ship, and debts had mounted far beyond what even the Beaufort name could conceal. Mortgages, unpaid loans, and obligations stacked higher than the chandeliers that lit their dinner tables. Without drastic measures, the plantations would be seized, the Charleston mansion sold at auction, and the Beaufort legacy disgraced in public ruin. But Silas claimed he had found a solution. His voice, careful and deliberate, framed it as strategy, an ingenious maneuver rooted in inheritance laws and the loopholes of South Carolina's statutes. Piton shuffled through a stack of papers, his nervous fingers betraying the seriousness of what lay before them. Alela Nena listened as Silas explained that through a creative interpretation of family ties, they could protect everything. The scheme required her participation. By marrying her, Silas could secure control of the Ravenel properties that should have been hers by birthright, while simultaneously shielding them from creditors under laws that protected a wife's inheritance from her husband's debts. The words fell like ice around her, each syllable peeling away the last illusions of her place in the family. She realized then that every locked door, every silenced conversation, every carefully chosen word had been building to this moment. Not protection, but preparation. She was not their daughter. She was the key to their survival, and Silas intended to turn that key, no matter the cost. Silas assured her the marriage would be nothing more than a practical arrangement, a safeguard for the Beaufort fortune, and a guarantee of her own stability. He framed it as a logical step, a continuation of the life they had already given her. Attorney Josiah Piton backed his words with documents claiming that her parents had died without proper wills, leaving her with no legitimate claim to the Ravenel estate. According to his interpretation, she was penniless, a child whose survival and privilege had depended entirely on the Beaufort's charity. The marriage, he insisted, would simply formalize what had always been true, while protecting the family from ruin. For more than 2 hours, the discussion moved between calculated persuasion and legal jargon. Silas shifted effortlessly from a father's soothing tone to a businessman's cold pragmatism, while Piton buried her in statutes and precedents meant to confuse rather than clarify. Eleanor sat in silence, her instincts screaming warnings she couldn't yet put into words. The room seemed to close in around her, the smell of brandy and tobacco thickening the air until it mingled with something sharper, something that smelled like fear. That night, she withdrew to her chamber overlooking the harbor, her mind racing. She had always known her adoption was more than an act of kindness, but the reality was far darker than she had imagined. As she watched ships drifting past the barrier islands, a thought began to take shape, heavy and undeniable. Her parents' deaths and her own unlikely survival. might not have been chance at all. The weeks that followed only deepened her suspicion. Slowly, methodically, the truths she had been fed began to crumble. Determined to see for herself, Elena began her own investigation, drawing on the very education the Beauforts had provided. At the Charleston County Courthouse, she met Benjamin Hartwell, a meticulous clerk with a passion for preserving old records. Where the Beaufort attorney had offered only evasions, Hartwell provided clarity. He unearthed wills filed in 1846. Documents James and Sarah Ravenel had prepared with painstaking care, naming Eleanor as their sole heir and appointing trustees until she reached adulthood. Even more startling were the survey maps and deeds spread out before her, revealing the Ravenel holdings stretched far beyond what she had ever been told, a fortune that by rights was hers alone. The records Hartwell uncovered revealed something far larger than the plantation lost in the fire. The Ravenel estate had stretched across 3 counties, encompassing some of the most valuable rice-growing land in the Low Country, much of it bordering Beaufort property. The documents showed that Elena should have inherited a fortune that would have made her one of the wealthiest women in South Carolina. Yet what Hartwell laid out on the table was riddled with irregularities, missing pages, signatures that looked altered, and filing dates that didn't match courthouse logs. Someone with money, influence, and legal skill had been deliberately corrupting the paper trail piece by piece until her rightful inheritance had been obscured almost beyond recognition. Hartwell also admitted something that chilled her further. Over the years, representatives of the Beaufort family had repeatedly contacted him, under the guise of legal research, always asking about Ravenel property records. At the time, he thought nothing of it, but now, seen together, the pattern revealed a deliberate, sustained effort to monitor and possibly manipulate the evidence of her claims. Defying years of prohibitions, Elena traveled to the ruins of her childhood home. The site, overtaken by kudzu and young pines, still bore scars of the fire. But the closer she looked, the less sense the official story made. The stone foundation bore signs of multiple ignition points rather than a single accident. Scattered metal fragments suggested the use of accelerants or devices that didn't belong in a plantation home. The most damning discovery came when she unearthed the remains of her father's study safe. It had not melted in flames, as the sheriff's report claimed, but had been pried open with tools. Its contents had been taken before the fire ever reached it. Among the ashes, memories long buried began to return. She remembered voices, angry men in her father's study that night. She remembered being hidden in a narrow space between the walls, her father's urgent instructions to stay silent. She remembered the sharp smell of coal oil poured deliberately across the floors before the blaze erupted. These were not the blurred nightmares of a child, but fragments of truth smothered by years of manipulation. Her continued investigation exposed a chilling pattern. For more than 15 years, prominent low-country families had been struck by sudden misfortunes, their estates passing into Beaufort hands soon after. The Middletons lost their lives in a mysterious riverboat accident in 1841. Their rice plantations ended up sold off cheaply to Silas. In 1844, yellow fever wiped out the Draytons, their Charleston mansion, and lands transferred through complicated mortgages. The Hamptons simply vanished in 1846, their debts assumed by Silas in exchange for their property. Each time, the result was the same tragedy struck. Survivors were left powerless, and the Beaufort fortune grew larger under the guise of business necessity or community service. And at the center of the legal machinery, enabling these acquisitions, was always Josiah Peton, whose law practice had flourished in lockstep with the Beaufort's rise. Back at the East Bay Street mansion, Elena's growing suspicions were mirrored by unsettling changes. Margaret's health spiraled downward until she rarely left her chamber. Yet in brief flashes of lucidity, she began to speak of James and Sarah Ravenel, details of their lives and deaths. She should not have known hints that she carried knowledge of events buried deep beneath the family's carefully cultivated facade. The servants began to shrink away from Elena, their faces a mix of pity and fear, that told her they knew more than they would ever say. And she noticed men shadowing her steps around Charleston, always keeping a careful distance, yet somehow appearing wherever she went. Her letters vanished before she could read them. Her conversations were quietly monitored, and every excuse about propriety tightened the cage around her until she understood that her adopted life was a gilded prison. The confrontation that decided her fate came on a rain-soaked evening in late September 1855, when she returned from the courthouse to find the whole Beaufort family waiting in the parlor, their expressions stripped of pretense and full of grim purpose. The grandfather clock struck 8 as she crossed the threshold, each toll sounding like a countdown. Silas sat behind his mahogany desk with the composed air of a Judge. Charles stood by the fireplace, like a stiff officer with a loaded pistol resting on the mantel. Victoria perched in her mother's chair and looked drawn and tired, and Margaret had been brought downstairs in a wheelchair, with fresh bruises on her wrists that made it clear she had not come willingly. Heavy draperies blocked the harbor breeze. Extra lamps filled the room with an uneasy light, and smells that did not belong in a family home hung in the air, the metallic tang of fear, the bitter medicine on Margaret's breath, and beneath it all, a sweetness of corruption Elena now recognized. Silas wasted no time. His practiced fatherly tone had evaporated, and what came from him now was the language of business and control. He knew about the courthouse visits and the trip to the Ravenel ruins, he said. And he named where she had been, whom she had spoken with, and which documents she had read. Benjamin Hartwell. The helpful clerk had been feeding Charles Beaufort every step of her investigation, he explained, and the friendly questions about records were a careful trap that let her see just enough truth while the family kept every move under their control. Even her trip to the burned plantation had been watched, the men who followed her, making sure she discovered no evidence that could not be accounted for. And by the time Silas finished speaking, the room felt smaller and colder. And Elena understood that her search for the truth had been anticipated, contained, and turned into the final piece of the Beauforts' plan. The Beauforts had known everything. Their watchers reported back on what Elena uncovered at the ruins. The forced safe, the fire's multiple ignition points, the fragments of memory she had begun to reclaim after 8 years of silence. Her growing awareness had left them no choice but to accelerate their plans. What followed that evening in the parlor was not an argument, but a revelation, delivered with the cold precision of men who believed themselves untouchable. Silas began by stripping away the last illusions. The family's fortune, he admitted, was not built on the honest fruits of trade and harvests, but on a calculated campaign of murder and fraud that had stretched across 2 decades. Every plantation, every mansion, every political favor had been purchased in blood. James Ravenel had stood in their way, not because of personal rivalry, but because he possessed the one thing more dangerous than land-proof. His holdings were vast, cutting across prime rice fields, that if left in his hands, would block the Beauforts from creating an empire stretching unbroken from Charleston to Georgia. Worse, James had uncovered their crimes. It had started, Silas explained, when James noticed irregularities in the Middleton estate transfers. What began as a farmer's curiosity turned into a meticulous investigation. Over months, James pieced together a pattern: 17 families gone in accidents, illnesses, or sudden disappearances, their properties flowing neatly into Beaufort hands. He traced money trails, uncovered forged deeds, and collected witness statements from men who confessed to being hired under threats or bribes. He built a case that could have destroyed the Beaufort dynasty. Silas recalled their final meeting with chilling detachment, as though describing a business negotiation instead of the prelude to murder. James had laid out his findings like a prosecutor before trial. Signed confessions, forged documents, bank ledgers showing payments to killers, evidence that pointed directly to the Beaufort household. And most damning of all, testimony from Margaret herself, recorded during one of her fleeting moments of clarity, when the poisons clouding her mind had lifted. She had spoken of family meetings where murders were weighed like investments of rivals, eliminated with cold precision of hidden caches of evidence the Beauforts thought long destroyed. As Silas spoke, his tone carried no shame, no hesitation, only the matter-of-fact pride of a man recounting the efficiency of a well-run operation. To him, the destruction of the Ravenels had not been tragedy or crime, but necessity. And to Alela Nena, trapped in that shuttered parlor under the weight of her family's gaze, the full horror of her existence came crashing down her childhood. Her adoption, even her survival, had been shaped not by fate, but by the ruthless calculations of the Beaufort dynasty. Ravenel had asked for one last meeting, pretending it was to bargain for silence. But Silas knew from the start that no bargain could be struck. The evidence was too detailed, the investigation too thorough, and the danger to the Beaufort dynasty too immediate. There was only one solution: erase both the man and his proof. The fire that destroyed the Ravenel family was not a tragedy of chance, but a carefully staged operation led by Charles Beaufort, with 3 hired assassins brought in from New Orleans. These men, veterans of criminal enterprises along the Mississippi, had done such work before. They were given floor plans of the Ravenel home notes on the family's routines and precise instructions on which evidence to seize and burn. Charles himself had spent weeks studying the household, watching when the servants were dismissed, when Sarah and James retired, and when James worked late into the night in his study. The timing was perfect: a moonless sky, bone-dry autumn air, and a city asleep. On the night of the attack, the killers slipped through a basement door Charles had unlocked days earlier during a friendly visit. They moved like shadows, catching James and Sarah in the study, where they had been preparing documents meant for federal authorities. Their deaths were quiet, accomplished with chloroform-soaked cloths pressed over their faces. No struggle, no wounds, just lifeless bodies posed to look as if they had collapsed while fleeing the flames. Alela Nena survived only because her father had anticipated treachery. Months earlier, he had built a secret hiding space between the walls, reachable through her bedroom, stocked with food and water for days. He had drilled her relentlessly, telling her that if danger ever came, she must remain hidden no matter what she heard. From that narrow space, she bore witness to horror no child should endure. Through cracks in the paneling, she saw men rifling through her father's study, prying open the safe, seizing documents, and soaking the floors with coal oil. She heard her mother's muffled cries, her father's last desperate pleas, and the casual chatter of killers treating murder like routine work. She watched them scatter chemical accelerants brought in specifically to mimic an accidental fire, and knew instinctively that nothing would survive the blaze. When the flames rose, they burned hotter and faster than any household lamp could explain, collapsing the house into ash and burying whatever scraps of evidence might have remained. Silas's later display of compassion, arriving first at the scene, rescuing the lone survivor, adopting her as his daughter, had nothing to do with charity. It was strategy. Keeping Alela Nena close meant controlling her memories, suppressing her trauma, and ensuring that if she ever began to remember, the Beauforts would know. To them, she was not a daughter, but a liability disguised as family, the living key to secrets they had nearly destroyed, but could never be certain were truly gone. For 8 years, the Beauforts had invested time, money, and strategy into keeping Alela Nena under their control, always watching for any sign that she might recall where her father had hidden additional evidence. By raising her in isolation and cloaking their control as protection, they created the illusion of guardianship while ensuring her dependence. To Charleston society, they were benevolent benefactors. To themselves, she was an asset, her memories, her inheritance, her very life, all tools to secure their empire. The marriage proposal was not sudden impulse, but the culmination of nearly a decade of planning. Once she became Silas's legal wife, any property rights tied to the Ravenel name would transfer to him, and spousal immunity would silence her forever in any courtroom. If she refused, the family had already devised justifications for more drastic measures. Silas explained this with the steady calm of a man presenting a business deal, not a father speaking to a daughter. Then came the most chilling revelation of all. Margaret's decline had not been the cruelty of fate, but the deliberate result of arsenic slipped into her medicines over 2 long years. The poison mimicked chronic illness, robbing her of strength, clarity, and voice, leaving her unable to intervene or confide in anyone outside the house. Her death, inevitable within months, would free Silas to remarry while legally inheriting her dowry estate's properties, shielded from his debts by airtight prenuptial agreements. Elena was meant to step seamlessly into Margaret's place. The plan was airtight. A widower marrying his adopted daughter was unusual, but not scandalous in Charleston circles, where wealth and social position excused many indiscretions. Their influence over judges, bankers, and politicians would crush any legal challenges before they began. Gossip, if it arose, would fade under the family's weight of reputation. To society, it would be a respectable arrangement. To the Beauforts, it was the final lock snapping into place on a cage they had been building around Elena since the night of the fire. As she listened, horror spread through her like ice. Every kindness, every lesson, every smile had been calculated. The bedtime stories, the tutors, the carefully chosen gowns, all had been the scaffolding of a trap. And now the walls had closed in, leaving her no illusions about what her life had truly been. Not adoption, but captivity engineered for the day. She would no longer be their ward, but their possession. Every part of Elena's life had been engineered to strip away freedom while disguising captivity as privilege. The tutors, the gowns, the parties, all of it had been scaffolding for a prison built from silk and marble, a cage whose walls she hadn't noticed until they closed around her. Now the illusion of choice was gone. Marry Silas and live as a well-kept possession, or refuse and join the long list of families erased by the Beaufort dynasty. Charles stated it plainly, his words cutting away any pretense she knew too much to walk free. But her legal value was too great to kill unless she forced their hand. The threat was real. The same killers who had murdered her parents had never left Charleston. For months they had followed her through the city waiting for orders. If she tried to run, if she spoke to the wrong person, if she reached for help, they would silence her before she ever crossed the courthouse steps. And even if she did manage to present evidence, the Beaufort's reach extended into every chamber of power, sheriffs, judges, even federal officials whose positions depended on the favor of Charleston's richest men. Witnesses could vanish, records could be lost, investigations could collapse into nothing. Her word alone would be dismissed as the unhinged ramblings of a traumatized girl. The standoff in the parlor seemed absolute, until Margaret, frail and trembling in her wheelchair, rose with a strength none of them expected. Her voice, sharpened by the knowledge of her impending death, cut through the room like a knife. She revealed that she had never been as helpless as she appeared. For years she had quietly documented everything, conversations forged, deeds, bribes, even the very murders planned in that same parlor. The arsenic that poisoned her had become her disguise. Her confusion, her erratic memory, had served as the perfect cover to collect evidence under her family's noses. Hidden caches throughout the mansion contained her work. Financial records showing payments to hired killers. Letters proving corruption at every level of local government. Maps of plantations stolen through fraud and murder. Soil samples taken from burned estates that still bore chemical traces of accelerants. Most damning of all, her written accounts of family meetings where lives were reduced to line items, property to be shifted with the stroke of a pen, and murder discussed with the same calm efficiency as planting rice. For nearly 15 years, Margaret had been preparing a weapon in secret, and now in her final hours, she placed that weapon in Elelena's hands. What Margaret had first begun as a safeguard for herself had grown into a vast archive, a case file so thorough it could dismantle the Beaufort dynasty piece by piece in a federal courtroom. She had tracked not only their past crimes, but also their future plans, including the names of families marked for elimination and the officials already being bribed to clear the way. Her revelation shattered the parlor's balance of power. In an instant, the Beauforts saw their most fragile member transform into their greatest threat. The empire they had built on secrecy and intimidation began to collapse under the weight of her betrayal. The stakes could not have been higher. Exposure meant ruin not just of wealth, but of life itself. Federal prosecution for conspiracy, fraud, and murder would lead Silas and Charles to the gallows. Even Victoria, long shielded by her charm and social standing, faced years in prison for her complicity. The carefully rehearsed civility of the family council dissolved as panic and rage surfaced. Silas's calm turned quickly to snarling threats. Charles, no longer hiding behind pretense, reached toward the pistol resting on the mantel. The mask of Charleston gentility was gone, replaced by the raw brutality that had always fueled their rise. Margaret's defiance was sharper than any weapon they could wield. She announced that her evidence had been hidden in ways that guaranteed discovery, no matter what happened to her. She had given Elena both instructions and contacts federal agents who already suspected the truth and were waiting for proof to act. Silas and Charles lashed out their fear, driving them into violence, and the confrontation erupted into chaos. Margaret died in the struggle, her final breaths claimed by the poison that had weakened her and the blows of her own son. But her death was not in vain. In the turmoil, Elena seized a portion of the hidden records and slipped away into the storm. Her escape through Charleston's rain-drenched streets marked the unraveling of the Beaufort dynasty. Every alley and shadow concealed danger. The same killers who had destroyed her family years earlier now hunted her through the night, determined to prevent her from reaching the safety of federal protection. The storm cloaked her movements as much as it hindered them, forcing her to draw on instincts sharpened by years of quiet captivity. The evidence she carried was not just paperwork. It was the blueprint of a criminal empire, financial ledgers linking the Beauforts to professional assassins, letters exposing judges and sheriffs on their payroll maps, tracing the steady seizure of plantations across 3 states. Yet for all its weight, the evidence alone could not guarantee survival. Elena now faced a world she had been sheltered from at Charleston, where the reach of the Beauforts extended from corrupt city clerks to federal appointees in Washington. Every step towards safety was a step into a labyrinth of betrayal, violence, and uncertainty. But with Margaret's sacrifice and the storm, as her cover, Elena carried something far more dangerous than wealth or land. The truth and the power to finally bring the Beaufort dynasty to its knees. The refuge Margaret had promised Elena nearly collapsed the moment she tried to use it. When she first approached the federal marshal's office with her evidence, the very officials she trusted alerted the Beauforts almost immediately. She barely escaped, with her life forced once again into the rain-slick streets, hunted and desperate. Survival came through an unlikely ally. Benjamin Hartwell, the courthouse clerk she had once believed was feeding information to Charles. In truth, Hartwell had been playing a longer game. His reports about her activities had been carefully worded to shield her, guiding her investigation in ways that exposed the truth while keeping her just beyond the Beaufort's reach. Hartwell revealed that federal authorities had been quietly investigating Southern criminal syndicates for years, working through a web of trusted insiders who could gather evidence while navigating the corruption that plagued local courts. With Alela Nena's testimony and Margaret's hidden archives, the investigation finally reached critical mass. What emerged was not just the exposure of one family's greed, but the unmasking of a criminal network that stretched across the Deep South. Corrupt judges, bought sheriffs, compromised politicians, and professional killers who had eliminated rival families for nearly 20 years. The scope stunned even seasoned prosecutors. The Beauforts were only one node in a larger web reaching into Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, where plantations had quietly changed hands through a grim formula of tragedy and fraud. Margaret's meticulous records paired with Alela Nena's first-hand knowledge proved devastating. By early 1856, federal indictments were issued not only against the Beauforts, but against more than 40 accomplices, lawyers, bankers, magistrates, and overseers whose cooperation had made the conspiracy possible. Hundreds of suspicious deaths and property transfers were re-examined, exposing how deeply violence and corruption had distorted land ownership across the Low Country. The arrests shook Charleston to its core. Men who had been pillars of society, judges in black robes, legislators at the State House, merchants whose names were engraved on the city buildings were marched into custody on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Silas Beaufort himself was seized as he tried to flee aboard a ship bound for Cuba, where he planned to reinvent himself while tapping foreign accounts already seeded with blood money. Federal marshals intercepted the vessel in Charleston Harbor, uncovering not only gold and documents, but also detailed blueprints for expanding the operation into other states. Charles Beaufort resisted with violence. A shootout at the family mansion left 2 marshals wounded and several of the hired New Orleans killers dead. Charles himself was struck down surviving, but left partially paralyzed. His defiance, intended to show strength, only sealed the image of guilt in the public mind, stripping him of any claim to youthful innocence. Victoria's downfall came more quietly. Arrested without resistance, she astonished prosecutors by laying bare her deep knowledge of the family business. Far from the delicate socialite Charleston believed her to be, she had managed ledgers, negotiated debts, and even overseen arrangements with corrupt officials. Faced with the collapse of her world, she bargained her testimony in exchange for reduced charges. Her insider knowledge proved critical, exposing layers of conspiracy even Margaret had not documented. By the summer of 1856, Charleston was riveted by trials that drew national attention. Newspaper editors framed them as the unmasking of the South's empire of shadows. In crowded courtrooms, the polished veneer of Charleston's elite was stripped away, replaced by transcripts of murder plots, bribery schemes, and financial records inked in blood. For Alela Nena, the proceedings were both vindication and torment, proof that her memories were true, and a reminder of the life stolen from her. The Beaufort dynasty, once untouchable, now stood as a cautionary tale of how greed, power, and corruption could consume even the proudest of families. The Charleston Federal Courthouse became the stage for one of the most sensational trials of the antebellum era, drawing crowds of journalists, politicians, and scholars eager to witness the unraveling of a dynasty that had once seemed untouchable. What began as the prosecution of a single family soon grew into an indictment of the system itself, exposing the cracks in Southern society's legal and political foundations. Testimony and evidence laid bare not only the Beauforts' crimes, but also the systemic corruption that had enabled them to flourish unchecked for decades. At the center of it all was Alela Nena. Her testimony connected Margaret's hidden archives and the physical evidence with the family's long history of calculated violence. She faced the courtroom not as the broken orphan the defense attempted to portray, but as a poised and determined young woman. Her voice and presence stood as living proof that resilience could break even the most elaborate chains of manipulation. The prosecutors presented a staggering picture: at least 37 families eliminated in ways that directly benefited the Beauforts, with evidence of more deaths lost to destroyed records and silenced witnesses. The financial scale shocked the nation: over $2 million in stolen land and assets, one of the largest criminal fortunes in American history. The verdicts were as dramatic as the evidence. Silas Beaufort was convicted of murder, fraud, and conspiracy, sentenced to hang in March 1857 before thousands of onlookers. His final words contain no remorse, only a bitter denunciation of federal interference in what he called legitimate business. Charles received the same sentence after a violent arrest and a long appeals process, finally executed in 1859. Victoria, exposed as a knowing partner in the scheme, was sentenced to 20 years but served 12 before being released. Her health ruined by what many suspected were the same poison medicines that had consumed her mother. The fallout went far beyond the Beauforts themselves. More than 20 public officials faced prison terms. Dozens of business associates lost everything through forfeiture, and Charleston's legal establishment came under sweeping federal scrutiny. The case set precedents for prosecuting interstate criminal conspiracies and marked a rare moment when the federal government intervened in Southern affairs, proving that even entrenched corruption could be dismantled. For Elena, the outcome was both vindication and burden. The courts restored not only her parents' holdings, but also awarded her compensation for property stolen from victim families with no surviving heirs. Overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in the South. But she used her fortune not merely to rebuild her life, but to bring closure for the families of the dead. Through donations, compensation, and the creation of trusts, she ensured that justice reached further than the courtroom. The management of her vast estate required new institutions that would become models for transparent agricultural trusts, reshaping Southern business practices in ways that curbed corruption. Yet wealth could not erase memory. Soon after the trials concluded, Elena quietly left Charleston. She sought distance from the city that had taken her parents, imprisoned her youth, and made her a symbol of both survival and scandal. She withdrew from public life, but her influence remained in the schools she funded, the charities she endowed, and the families who finally found acknowledgement for their losses. In leaving, she ensured her story would not be confined to tragedy alone, but remembered as the tale of a young woman who had broken a dynasty built on blood and shadow. Elena's legacy was defined not only by the fortune she reclaimed, but by what she chose to do with it. In the decades following the Beaufort trials, she directed her wealth towards schools and charities in other states' institutions designed to protect those most vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that had once trapped her. Her academies focused on orphaned children and young women without guardians, recognizing that isolation and dependence had been the very levers the Beauforts used to control her and countless others. She believed that education and community support were the strongest defenses against manipulation. Yet even as she built these safeguards for others, the scars of her own past never fully healed. The correspondence she left behind, preserved in the archives of her foundations, shows a woman who lived with constant unease, struggling with trust, haunted by recurring nightmares, and shadowed by a lingering fear of betrayal. Outwardly, she was resilient and determined, a symbol of justice rising from tragedy. Privately, the trauma remained a companion until her final days. The process of dismantling the Beaufort estate was as tangled as their crimes. Federal officials spent more than a decade untangling fraudulent deeds, false claims, and doctored inheritance records to ensure that stolen lands were restored to their rightful heirs. Where families had been erased entirely, restitution funds were created to compensate distant relatives or communities. The East Bay Street mansion stained too deeply with blood and infamy was never sold. Instead, it was torn down, the ground left bare until a modest park was built. A small plaque marks the spot, honoring the victims without indulging in the grisly details. Even today, locals say the air there feels heavy, as if the sorrow of the past refuses to lift. The Beaufort case reached far beyond Charleston. It forced lawmakers to confront the failures that had allowed such corruption to thrive unchecked. Property law and inheritance procedures were tightened, judicial oversight expanded, and new precedents were set for handling disputes born of criminal fraud. The case also reshaped federal law enforcement investigators, used it as a model for dismantling other hidden conspiracies across the South, uncovering similar patterns of violence and fraud in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia. In the end, the Beaufort dynasty was remembered not only for its cruelty, but for the reforms it unintentionally inspired. What had begun as one family's ruthless quest for power became the catalyst for exposing how deeply corruption had rooted itself in antebellum society. Elela Nena's courage ensured that those crimes were not simply buried beneath layers of wealth and influence, but brought to light in a way that changed both Charleston and the nation. The Beaufort case has earned a lasting place in American legal history, not only because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about the fragile line between power and justice in the antebellum South. Historians now view it as a turning point, one of the earliest examples where the federal government successfully prosecuted an interstate criminal conspiracy, creating precedents that would later prove vital during Reconstruction and the long struggle to enforce civil rights in the face of entrenched local corruption. At the heart of that history stands Elela Nena Ravenel. Her story is not just about survival, but about transformation from an orphan child trapped in a web of lies to a woman who used her voice and her will to bring down a dynasty. She showed that even the most carefully crafted system of intimidation and violence could crumble when confronted by truth and persistence. Her courage continues to resonate, because it forces us to reckon with both the darkness of unchecked power and the light of individual resistance. The infamous marriage certificate in Charleston's courthouse is a powerful symbol of just how close the Beaufort conspiracy came to succeeding. Though her name never appeared on that document, its existence is a reminder that history often turns on a single choice, a single refusal to surrender. Today it stands as both artifact and warning evidence of how easily institutions can be bent by corruption and how much it can cost to resist. Elela Nena's journey is more than a story of crime and punishment. It is a lesson in resilience, morality, and the human capacity to demand justice, even in impossible circumstances. The Beauforts may have left behind scars that stretched across families and generations, but her defiance left a deeper legacy, proof that truth, when wielded with courage, can outlast even the most powerful conspiracies. So now the question lingers for us: was justice truly served? Or were the Beaufort's crimes so vast that no trial could ever fully balance the scales? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story unsettled you as much as it inspired you, subscribe, share with someone who loves hidden history, and join us next time as we uncover another shadowed chapter from America's forgotten past.